I've got a screen saying, do I want to join?
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the ISMTE 2021 Global Event. My name is Anna Jester, and I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing at eJournal Press, as well as a member of the ISMTE North American Conference Planning Committee. I am pleased to moderate this session, Preprints, particularly in the pandemic, and how to integrate them into your workflow. The pandemic dramatically expanded the preprint use in all disciplines, with more than 30,000 preprints of research on SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 shared since January of 2020. Many are now published in journals and/or being cited. The speakers in this session will describe the explosion in preprint use and discuss best practices for citing preprints and handling metadata during the preprint lifecycle. Our first speaker is John Inglis from bioRxiv Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Dr. Inglis is a professor at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, co-founder of the laboratory's preprint servers bioRxiv and medRxiv, and founding executive director and publisher of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press. He serves as an advisory board member of MIT Press and the Research on Research Institute, and as a director of the Life Science Alliance. He has a PhD in immunology from the University of Edinburgh Medical School, and was formerly an assistant editor of The Lancet and founding editor of Immunology Today. Our second speaker is Bruce Rosenblum from Inera. Bruce has been designing and implementing electronic publishing workflows and solutions for over 35 years. He is the developer of the Crossref metadata deposit schema, not even kidding, and co-authored the original NLMDTD. Again, not even kidding. He served on the National Information Standards, or NISO, Board of Directors from 2005 to 2013, and is currently co-chair of the NISO STS Working Group and an active member of the JATS and BITS working groups. I am thrilled to have John and Bruce here to present on this topic. It's a timely discussion that journals will continually be monitoring, and I look forward to our speakers' insights as well as our questions from the audience. I will also just quickly note we also have our conflict of interest screen here as well, and you can see those conflicts. And of course, our session is being recorded. All right, so I have stopped sharing my screen. John, if you would like to go ahead and share yours, and I will also launch the first poll for our groups.
So I'm sorry, Anna, I'm not seeing the sharing screen icon.
Sure. No problem. So it's down at the bottom, and I think it looks like an arrow inside of a rectangle.
Oh, yes, here we are.
And then I think you'll want to choose from the options there, the one on the right that is not for PDF. And then from the window, and I would go ahead and put your presentation already in presentation mode before you share it.
Okay, that I can do. Sorry about the delay.
Oh, no worries.
But I'm clicking on that arrow and it says that I'm not getting anything. Should I say PDF or PowerPoint or something at that point?
So yeah, on the right-hand side, so if you've said share screen, and then in the middle where it says window, do you have 3 up at the top that say entire screen window?
Oh, I'm sorry to be so useless.
No, please.
Thought I had this down, but what I'm seeing is under conversations, there is an arrow, but I'm not.
So no, I'm not sure, but if you'd like, I can go ahead and just share your slides.
Well, I've made some modifications to the set that you saw, so I should not do that. But tell me again where to find this arrow.
So down at the bottom of your screen, do you have a number of different icons, including one, if you mouse over it, says present to audience?
Ah, there we go. That's it.
And then of those 2 options you have after that on the right-hand side, choose the share window, I think it is, and then after that, you will once again have options at the top
Yes.
to choose. Assuming, yeah.
I think we're good. Can you see that?
Yep, I sure can.
All right. Well, it would help if it was not the first slide, wouldn't it? Okay. My apologies, everyone, for the incompetence of my start. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Anna, for the introduction and the invitation to do it. It's always a pleasure to share the stage with Bruce. So as Anna said, we're here to talk about preprints. And I am speaking on behalf of a wonderful group of colleagues who are responsible for making the preprint servers I'm talking about actually work. The founders, the content team, the product and technology developers. They are a terrific group to work with. Preprints are, I believe, transforming the way that scientists are communicating with each other and the world. And the reason they are doing that most particularly is there are two reasons. One, the value proposition really revolves around the speed of dissemination and the control over the process that the authors have. And I do not need to go through the top diagram for this audience. You are very well familiar with the process. Preprints, on the other hand, offer the chance to distribute a manuscript before peer review and with a great deal of control over the process. There are many different kinds of preprint servers. They offer the chance to different communities, to different disciplines, sometimes different languages or different countries. They do not work all the same, and I am really only going to talk about the Cold Spring Harbor preprint servers that are focused in biology, bioarchive, and medical sciences, medRxiv. These are not-for-profit projects that have their roots in an academic institution, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, that has really been serving the research community for more than 100 years. They are funded by the laboratory, and also we are lucky to have grant support from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. The content is free to post and to read. These servers operate with a lot of integration with journals and publishers, but they operate independently of those entities. And we do not see these as products or publications. They're really services, and they are not a service that you need to take advantage of in order to submit a paper to a journal. So bioRxiv is very nearly 8 years old. It has a large number of preprints, just some basic data here. It has posted so far this year over 29,000 new manuscripts. And as you can see, the amount of usage that bioRxiv gets in a given month is very considerable. medRxiv is only 2 years old. It has a smaller number of preprints, but that too is growing. We've posted 10,000 preprints just in this year alone. And medRxiv has been enormously influenced by the pandemic over the last 18 months. And the usage data there are considerable as well. So preprint servers provide certain kinds of services for the authors, for the information producers. Primarily speed, as I've said. A preprint can be posted 6 months to 2 years before its journal version arrives. We offer all kinds of control to the authors over many aspects of how their manuscript reaches the world, and I've listed those there. The preprint comes with a citable DOI, which is a very valuable thing for example, a young researcher to have when she is applying for a job or applying for a grant. Instead of saying manuscript submitted, there is a manuscript that anyone who wants to evaluate her work can see very readily. We also do a lot to encourage community feedback in various ways with commenting on the site, also social media accounts that prompt, particularly Twitter, that prompt engagement with the work concerned. We offer altmetric data and download data. And in addition, we offer the opportunity for an author to submit their manuscript directly to a journal into the submission system of a journal from within bioRxiv and medRxiv. And the numbers of journals with which bioRxiv and medRxiv are integrated is growing rapidly, currently over 200 for bioRxiv and over 100 for medRxiv, but these numbers will continue to increase over the next few months. And when that manuscript is published in the journal, then we make links between the preprint and the published version. We also offer services for information consumers, readers, of course, but also editors, publishers, and even institutions. And screening of the manuscript is an essential part of that. These manuscripts are not peer-reviewed. They are not evaluated for quality or accuracy, but they are checked in a variety of ways, mostly all of which I've shown you here. I don't want to go through each of these steps. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are checks that are applied by both servers, and then the latter 4 are specific checks that are appropriate to medically relevant information. You can see there that they cover a variety of concerns that we have about the release of clinically relevant information freely into the community. We also offer a service we call J2B for bioRxiv, which is the opportunity, should a journal or editor wish to offer that to an author, the opportunity to simultaneously deposit a manuscript on a server at the same time as a manuscript is submitted to the journal. And we have 15 publishers who have entered into those kinds of arrangements, 37 journals, and that number too is set to increase over the next few months. Within the corpus of bioRxiv, we've just recently introduced the ability to track an individual manuscript and be alerted as a reader to the fact that there may be a new version of it, or there may be comments on it, or maybe it's been published. And that is new, but already we have 1,300 readers who are following manuscripts of their choice. We also offer a variety of discovery tools, feeds, RSS feeds, Twitter sub-accounts, and the ability to be alerted in response to keywords. Channels are an ability to collect preprints by theme, and that theme could be a subject, or it could be a particular project, or it even could be an institution. We also have XML repositories that are freely available for text and data mining. And something I'm not going to talk about today, but we also have now introduced a dashboard which aggregates reviews and evaluations and various forms of attention that an individual preprint has attracted. So we're going to talk about the pandemic and how could we not? It's had such a dramatic influence on everything, every aspect of our lives, and scientific communication has, of course, been part of that. The NIH Office of Portfolio Analysis is keeping track of the COVID-19 related literature, and this is a snapshot from yesterday of their collection. They've identified 120,000 journal articles, but also 37,000 preprints that are relevant to the pandemic in different ways. And I've called out here the different preprint servers that have posted preprints related to different aspects of the pandemic. And as you can see, medRxiv is up there at the top. The pandemic-related preprints that we have posted, this is a chart that shows the distribution from the beginning of the pandemic until now. And as you can see, in January 2020, down there on the left, in the second half of January, we began to see manuscripts about this, the emergence of this condition. Many of them from China. The early manuscripts, there were 30 in the second half of January 2020. They included the description of the sequence of SARS-CoV-2, also an early estimate of the R number of the epidemic. There were no manuscripts related to the pandemic in medRxiv in January, and then suddenly in February, there were 221. And as you can see, between then and June, May and June, there was an explosion of contributions to medRxiv about all aspects of the pandemic. And so you can see the breakdown of the different numbers between the two servers. That peak in May and June of last year has declined, but there is still a substantial number of COVID-related manuscripts appearing on both servers. And that concentration of topic on medRxiv was reflected in the usage data that we detected. As you can see, in April of 2020, there were more than 10 million abstract page views. And that while it has diminished a bit over time, the usage is still very significant, both as measured by abstract views or full text views or PDF downloads. So that's volume and that's attention. What about significance? How important were these contributions? I think we can't really judge that. We're still a bit close to it. But I thought this was a striking paper, a review article from early in 2021, looking back at the milestones in pandemic research in 2020. And they identified, as to support their contention about what was important in pandemic research, they've identified 168 citations. It turns out that 12 are specifically to preprints, 8 of them medRxiv, but 42 of those citations, those journal articles that were cited, have equivalent matching preprints. So I think that speaks to the fact that there was a great deal of important science that was posted first to the preprint servers, obviously stimulated by the urgent need of the scientists concerned to share what they were finding with colleagues all over the world. And I've listed here just some of the topics that are related to the pandemic on both bioRxiv and medRxiv. The red arrow next to the protein interaction network simply reminds me to say that that paper posted on bioRxiv, I think in around March of last year, was a sudden collaboration between a number of research institutes in California who got together essentially to try to identify proteins within human cells that were targets of the virus. And they developed a toolkit of plasmids that were subsequent to the publication, the posting of this manuscript, were sent out around the world to over 500 research institutions to allow people to continue this work. The other red arrow points to recovery trials. This is a project from Oxford University where they have systematically done controlled clinical trials of different forms of therapy and found that many of the therapies that have received a great deal of publicity, such as hydroxychloroquine, had no merit when looked at in an appropriate context. Dexamethasone, however, turned out to have great value in the treatment of certain kinds of COVID patients. And very soon after the posting of that preprint, dexamethasone became standard of care around the world. And that was posted I think 4 months or so before the paper was finally published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So without wanting to belabor this, I think the value of preprint server in the pandemic has been the speed of dissemination and the ability to share the learning that certain groups are able to develop in particular parts of the world. In terms of how much impact this has had, the graphic on the left is a snapshot of an altmetric daily report from 2 or 3 days ago, referring to the degree of attention that articles in medRxiv are getting. And as you can see, there's a good deal of activity. Obviously, it goes up and down over time, but it's very often at this sort of level. Substantial amounts of social media attention and a great deal of news coverage. And the graphic on the right is the article on medRxiv that has received the most attention, or has the highest attention score so far. One that deals with the question of reinfection after vaccination. And there are a large number of medRxiv papers that have very significant attention scores. So the desire of the research community to use preprint servers over the last couple of years is now receiving academic research attention in and of itself. Here is an article from PLOS Biology in April, in which Nicholas Fraser and Johnny Coates and colleagues compared pandemic-related preprints with other preprints on servers that were not specifically related to COVID-19. And what they found was that pandemic-related preprints were accessed more, they were cited more, shared more, and they were published faster. And this confirmed our own data, which shows, because we track the publication of preprints, and we showed very clearly that pandemic-related preprints were being published twice as fast at one point last year than preprints that were on other topics. The paper at the bottom that simply is making the point. They used various measures of quality of reporting and found that that there really was very little difference between a preprint version and a journal published version. They weren't looking at COVID in particular, but just in preprints in general. Now, that is not to say that everything on preprint servers is good science, and we are entirely aware of the fact that poor quality science is appearing on preprint servers. However, it's not just a problem of preprint servers. But when flawed work appears on medRxiv and bioRxiv, it can have serious consequences. On the top right, there is an article that appeared on the 31st of January, 2020, in which the authors thought they had seen a similarity in the sequence of the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 to HIV. This was posted on a Friday afternoon. The reaction from the research community over the weekend was so aggressive and critical that the authors withdrew the paper 2 days later. And you can see there were posted on the site itself 127 comments related to this work. The paper down underneath, addressing the role of vitamin D, is an interesting case. It was posted, and then in response to community comments, the authors realized that it was essentially a meta-analysis. They'd failed to take into account different reporting standards in different countries. They withdrew this version of the article, they reanalyzed their data, they added to it, and they posted new versions. In fact, they posted 2 new versions since then, in which they have confirmed their conclusions and updated their data. So it is possible to withdraw a version of a manuscript, but then to correct it. And they have done that extremely successfully. The case on the left is more recent. This was an episode involving an institute in Ottawa, where they posted a paper, an analysis of the incidence of myocarditis in children who had received, in young people who had received COVID-19 vaccination. And they made, frankly, a mathematical error, which was pointed out very quickly by a whole series of comments, both on the site, as you can see, there are 39 comments, also on Twitter. And the consequence of that was that the article was withdrawn within a week. So, as I said, there are consequences if mistakes are made, because the public attention to these pieces is so great. The degree of withdrawal of pandemic-related preprints is no greater than the degree of withdrawal of unrelated preprints. And I've given some reasons why authors wish to withdraw at the bottom of the slide. So,
and I hate to interrupt, I just want to note too, we need to be conscious of time.
Sure. So I'm just going to wrap up, Anna, by saying that preprints absolutely need to be treated with caution, but then so do many other information sources, op-eds, of which there have been many related to COVID that have turned out to be entirely wrong. Many experts who get involved in COVID analysis without having the appropriate expertise. And of course, we're probably, as many people know, there have been some high-profile instances of peer-reviewed papers that needed to be withdrawn. So I think those are my remarks. I will skip the concluding slide, except to say that preprints are still new. We are all, as a community of researchers, of publishers, as media, as journalists, we're all becoming more familiar with how to handle them. But the research community is in no doubt that the opportunity to share their work quickly and expediently is of great value to them. And we are seeing continued growth in the use of both bioRxiv and medRxiv. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John. And yeah, it was hard to even want to say we should. I felt I should probably. Okay.
No, good. I'm sorry for going over my time.
Oh my gosh, no. I would say that's one of the great things about the internet, right? Is that we will be recording everything, and so really, I think if we go a little bit over time, then we probably will be forgiven by most. Although I say that, I don't know what the actual ISMTE people feel about that. But okay, so Bruce, I'm going to go ahead now and attempt to share your slides. Let me know if.
Great, thank you.
And I think we're good.
Okay, great. Thank you, John, for kicking this off. I actually want to pick up on something you said a moment ago, that preprints are new. And as with any change that comes about in publishing, there's a maturation process. And one of the areas where we've seen a maturing slowly happening is around citation of preprints. And so what I'm going to talk about now is citing preprints and the challenges you run into and how to tackle them. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So as John pointed out, with the pandemic, we have seen an explosion of preprints. And of course, with the preprints, because things were moving so quickly, we saw an explosion of citations to preprints. And that's happening basically because posting is moving faster than peer review and publishing. So as an example, 2 to 3 years ago, I know a lot of journal managing editors who would say, you can't have a citation to a preprint in your bibliography. We won't accept it. That's a barrier that's largely come down just as acknowledgement of reality. that you need to be able to cite preprints as part of fast-moving literature. Next slide, please. And did we have a poll?
Yep, exactly. So I will go ahead and just really quickly, there we go, publish the poll. Hopefully that's gone out. Okay. Should we go ahead and leave that open for a little?
Sure.
To go ahead and continue.
Sure. So next slide, please.
Okay. There we go.
So why are preprint citations challenging? There are a number of reasons. First of all, not all preprint servers identify their content as preprints. And I should point out immediately here, bioRxiv and medRxiv do a great job with this, but that's not true for everyone else. Second, recommended citations that authors may download or copy from those preprint servers may be incomplete compared to what's needed. Or third, authors, if they're just making a citation up by hand, frequently that will be incomplete. And finally, there are gaps in the metadata record that make citation completion and verification somewhat challenging. Next slide, please. So let's look at the first of these. Preprint servers don't always identify their content as not peer-reviewed. Above is the statement that appears on bioRxiv, and it clearly points out that these are preliminary and have not been peer-reviewed. On the other hand, below is a screen capture from a site called mindArchive, where it says nothing about the fact that its content is not peer-reviewed. It just says that it's not affiliated with other preprint servers. And nowhere on the site could we find information about that. Next slide, please. This leads to an interesting problem, which is many times papers, even from bioRxiv and medRxiv, will be cited in the popular press, as an example, without mentioning that they have not yet been peer-reviewed. So here's a screenshot in the middle of a piece of an article that was published in nationalgeographic.com in one of their daily newsletters, and it got a lot of play about Zoom fatigue not being equally distributed and how women reported more Zoom fatigue than men. And I immediately went looking at the article and thought, oh yeah, this sounds really interesting, in part because it was getting some interesting press. And I went through and found that the article was on SSRN, and nowhere on SSRN was there any indication that there was a preprint. There's no way to tell that it's not peer-reviewed. Now, this does lead to an interesting question. I was talking with the science journalist from a major national publication recently, mainstream media, not peer-reviewed. And I asked her, when you cite a preprint, when you're writing, do you make a point of saying it's not yet peer-reviewed? And she said, most readers don't know what that means, and so I often don't bother. And in my mind, that's doing a disservice for readers because they should understand whether or not literature has gone through peer review at the point that it's being cited. So clarifying whether or not something is a preprint is something that's often lacking. Next slide, please. The next problem we run into is that recommended citations on preprint servers often don't indicate that an item is a preprint. So here's a preprint actually about preprints, and it's actually a really good paper. I recommend you read it if you're interested in some of the issues around preprints. And they've got APA, MLA, and Chicago style citations. And in none of these, unless you know that OSF Preprints is a preprint server, in none of these does it explicitly say that this item is a preprint. And in fact, in the first one, the APA style one, they don't even have the name of the preprint server. Next slide, please. The other problem that you run into is in some styles, for example, MLA, they don't recommend including a DOI. And so this particular item is left hanging that it's a web item, but you don't know how to get back to it without going to Google or without literally going through OSF preprints and searching for it there. So that is in turn a huge disservice to the reader. You've essentially got an editorial style that says, don't include the DOI, and that makes it much harder to access the appropriate copy of the content. Next slide, please. The next problem we run into is not just that the recommended citations may not include a DOI, but author preprint citations often don't include a DOI. So these are some examples that we took from actual manuscripts that we found actually in both cases on preprint servers, we downloaded the PDF of the Word file, and we found citations to bioRxiv and medRxiv, and there was no DOI provided. Well, you may think, great, we can look that up, but I'll come back to that in a second. That's not always an easy thing to do. So again, lack of a DOI can often hinder having an appropriate citation. Next slide, please. So after pointing out all these problems, what I want to focus on for a couple of slides is how we think you really should go about citing a preprint. And there are 6 key elements. First, you want the authors of the preprint. Second, you want the date that it was posted. Third, you want the title of the preprint. Fourth, despite what we saw in one of those earlier slides, you definitely want the name of the preprint server. So whether it's medRxiv, bioRxiv, mindRxiv, any other server, you want the name of the preprint server there. And there are good reasons for that as well, that I'll come back to in a minute. You want some sort of an indication that the item is a preprint. And lastly, you want the DOI so that it's very easy for someone to get to the appropriate copy of that preprint. Now, with the preprint server name, it's especially important because we've seen cases of the same preprint being posted on 2 or 3 different preprint servers, and they may not all be an identical version of the paper. So you want to know which version of the paper you're looking at. That's why the server name is so important. And with the DOI, it's important because some preprints, as John pointed out a few minutes ago, will have multiple versions. And what you want to be able to do is capture not just the DOI to that preprint, but ideally the DOI to the version that you read, because if a preprint is corrected and reposted in a new version, you want to make sure that if you're basing your science off of a specific version, that you're pointing to exactly that version. Next slide, please. So here's an example from the AMA manual of style. This is something we consider a good preprint citation. It has all 6 of those elements. So Anna, I had another poll put up here, which I believe is, does your style guide for authors clarify how preprints should be cited? So you may specify how references, what format references should appear. You may have examples of journal or book chapter references. Do you specifically discuss preprint citations or have an example of that? Next slide, please. So another thing to keep in mind with preprints is that when a preprint is posted, it has a title. When the article is finally accepted into a journal and published, the journal publisher is going to typically deposit a new DOI for that. And Crossref has a system where it can look at the authors and the title to try to match them up. And my recollection is that is how a fair amount of the backfill is happening. So when you see a link to the journal article on medRxiv or bioRxiv, I believe that's happening because they're getting updated data from Crossref indicating here's the published version. And John, please feel free to jump in if I'm wrong on that. Well, if in the process of either submission of that article or publication of that article or in the editorial process, a significant change happens in the title, Crossref's system for matching will fail. And so here's an example of a preprint title that appeared in March of 2020, and the final published article title was so significantly different that it wasn't possible for Crossref to make that linkage. So something to keep in mind is if you know that an article you're editing was posted as a preprint, you may want to be careful either about how you edit the title or making sure that if you do significantly edit the title, that in the end, a link back is made to the original preprint site. Next slide, please. Another challenge we've run into, and I pointed this out earlier, that if DOIs are missing, it may be tough to fill them in. Crossref returns inconsistent results, even when you make the exact same query 30 seconds apart. So here's an example of a preprint that didn't have a DOI, and we literally queried the same item 2 times 30 seconds apart. The first time we got back from Crossref no response, that it just didn't have a DOI for it. The second time, we got back the DOI on medRxiv, and then in addition, we got back that linkage information that it had been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So if you're counting on Crossref querying to get DOIs back for preprints in your publication process, beware that it is somewhat erratic. It will not give you consistent results. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, authors can post preprints on 2 or more preprint servers. Here's an example of one that appeared very rapidly across 2 weeks on 3 different servers. My instinct, and I don't have data to back this, is it originally appeared on Lancet preprints on our SSRN because the article was submitted to the Lancet. And then when they didn't accept it, it then ended up on both the WHO preprint site as well as on medRxiv in an effort to continue to cascade the paper. I have no idea where this paper may have finally been published. But as you can imagine, trying to link everything up at Crossref, where you've got 3 different versions of the same preprint, each with its own DOI, and a final published article, does present some challenges. I'm not going to take a personal stance on whether it's appropriate for an article to appear on 2 or more preprint servers. Sometimes that's happening simply because as an article may be submitted to 2 or more journals in the process of getting to acceptance, sometimes an article may be preprinted automatically or with author opt-in just in the process of submission, and that can cascade the number of preprints. Next slide, please. Another thing that I've seen, and again, this is not something that happens on bioRxiv or medRxiv, but on some preprint servers, they will replace the preprint with the final published article. And that is completely inappropriate because if there were significant changes between the preprint and the final published article, for example, if claims may have been toned down a little bit in the process of going through peer review and editorial, it's important to be able to see what the original preprint was, because if that's what's being cited, you want to understand those claims in the context of a new article that may be citing that preprint as opposed to citing the final article. So what's been done on this particular preprint server, medRxiv, is inappropriate, that they literally took down the preprint and they just point to the final published article. Next slide, please. John mentioned that a small number of preprints are withdrawn, and it's great that that happens, especially because of community feedback. I mean, it's not great that preprints need to be withdrawn, but it's great that the process is working, that feedback is being collected, and authors sometimes step back and say, you know what, I need to withdraw this preprint. Unfortunately, there are gaps in the metadata record. The most glaring is that there is no way to register a withdrawal of a preprint on Crossref. So if you're querying a citation to a preprint on Crossref and you get back a DOI, there's no way with that metadata record that comes back to learn that that preprint has been withdrawn. The only way you can find that out is actually going to medRxiv or bioRxiv or another preprint server that may have a withdrawn preprint. This is something that Crossref is working on, but it is something that's taking them time to put into place. So beware that while with Crossref and PubMed, you can find out if a paper has been retracted, a journal article, you can't find out if a preprint has been withdrawn. Next slide, please. So in summary, here are recommendations for preprints. First, any non-peer-reviewed content should be clearly identified at all stages. There is actually a standard or recommended practice from NISO on recommended practices for how journal article landing pages should appear. And I'd like to see something similar for preprints. I think a lot of, again, what Cold Spring Harbor is doing with medRxiv and bioRxiv definitely adheres to best practices, but that's not true across all preprint servers. As John pointed out, not all preprint servers are created equal. The second is if you don't include all of the 6 elements that we recommend in your citation style guide for preprints, you may want to review your style guide for that. The third is to make sure that metadata are integrated appropriately. Make sure preprints are being treated as a unique citation type. For example, if you use a vendor to create your XML, make sure they're not simply treating preprints as journal articles. They should not be. They should be treated as preprints. There are best practices about this. Make sure that when you deposit the DOI, that the preprint publication status gets updated if you've significantly changed the title. Don't replace a published version of the article with, don't replace a preprint with a published version of the article, and don't deposit preprints to cross-reference journal articles. And I point this out, I didn't talk about this earlier. Prior to about 3.5 years ago, the only way you could deposit preprints to Crossref was as a journal article. They now have a category called posted content. You should use that. Unfortunately, not all publishers have converted. There are still some major preprint servers that are using, that are depositing preprints as journal articles. And finally, make sure that the published version is going to cross-link with the preprint, both backwards and forwards, and that any withdrawn preprints are properly identified. Next slide, please. Just a couple of items, 3 items for recommended reading if you want to learn more. And thank you very much. And I think we are open for questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to both of you. And let me just really quickly see if I can also, before we start the questions, just show really quickly the results from what field does your journal or organization represent, as well as how does your journal feel about preprinting prior to peer review submission?
I find the answers to that interesting, that neutral was the single largest, followed by strongly against. I was talking with John just before the session started, and what I've seen just in informal conversations, both among researchers that I know on a personal level, as well as amongst publishers I work with, is much less of a negative view about preprints, and many publishers are much more willing to accept preprints of, accept that a submission has been preprinted first. And I'm really delighted to see that change, because I think it does help in certain areas. What about the results on the last poll?
And the other one there.
Okay, sharpen your pencils, please, attendees, and update your style guides.
Yeah. So I'm going to quickly move over to the Q&A as well, and just note that we had one question here about looking. So the editors for one of my journals are suddenly anti-preprint. I've been trying to find a plain text, easy to read history of preprints, pardon me, an explanation of why publishers and journals have agreed to allow them and not consider them duplicate publication. Can you help? So I will just also note, I'm going to copy and paste into the chat the links that Bruce included for the recommended reading that was in his slides as well, which I don't know that I would necessarily consider those plain text and easy to read, all of them. It really is about how much you know about scholarly publishing will definitely inform it. Always kind of delightful to see things like the names of people that you know, like Jeff Beck, that are included in there. So great choice of example there. So does anyone else have any other kind of history and explanation suggestions?
Anna, maybe I could just say to Alice that I'm not entirely sure from the question whether her editors were previously pro preprints and are now anti, or whether they just haven't sort of quite got up to speed with what they mean. The latter situation is regrettably, although Bruce is absolutely right, that things are changing in a positive way as far as I'm concerned, but we definitely still find instances of journal editors in particular, who sometimes journal editors who work for publishers where they have a very clear policy, but that policy hasn't come down to the editors. So the editors are concerned about duplication in particular. If Alice, you'd like to contact me directly, I can do what I can to share with you what you might share with your editors, because we've had this situation often when authors come to us and say, help, I'm having problems with a journal that think I've already published this paper. And when we make efforts to get in touch with the journal editors and explain the situation, and generally speaking, that has worked. So if Alice, if you'd like to contact me directly, I'd be happy to help with that.
I'll just add a couple of more thoughts on that. Clearly, there seems to be concern about duplicate publication. I don't know if that's just a smokescreen, but it might be worth going back to the editors and asking what their concerns are with preprints, and trying to sort of tease that out. I mean, sometimes in a lot of different contexts, I just try to tease out, well, what are your concerns? And that may help address the question. I'll also point out, I'm surprised if they've gone from neutral or pro to anti. That would surprise me. I can tell you in my personal life, I've run into a few things over the last few years where 2 years ago, I had asked some editors, gee, would you entertain a particular article if it was a preprint first? And I got back on a case-by-case basis. And I asked a similar group of editors the same question about 3 or 4 months ago. And every single editor who I asked said, no question that we'll consider the article. Just because it's been a preprint, that does not rule it out. So in my mind, that's a significant shift.
Thank you. All right, so I've got 2 more questions here, one for each of you specifically. So John, do you expect the number of preprint servers to continue to increase at the same level or exponentially?
Thanks for the question. No, I don't, to be quite honest. I think we're in a phase where there is much enthusiasm. There are new initiatives of different kinds, and not all of them are gaining traction for a variety of reasons. So I would think that what will happen is there will possibly be a reduction in the number going forward. I would be very surprised if the growth continued as it has over the last, say, 5 years.
I would concur with that. And also, I would say the number of papers that appear on preprint servers will continue to grow, but not the number of servers.
All right. Thank you so much. And then Bruce, I also, and John, I'd be happy to have you weigh in on this as well. What is the most difficult type of resource to cite appropriately? And are working groups, perhaps with which you are already involved, working to make it easier?
I think right now, the single hardest type of resource to cite appropriately is a data citation. A lot of times those aren't complete. And the reason why that's so important is because data citations are more and more getting special handling at Crossref, so that you make a tighter tie between depositive data and the journal article. In particular, and I've spoken about this at other meetings, if you deposit data with Zenodo, the recommended citation doesn't specify it's a data set versus software, which is a distinct citation type, versus a figure versus a conference paper. And so you can't automatically tell just from the name of the hosting site that it's a data citation. Right behind this is there's a brand new recommendation in draft form published about 2 weeks ago. It's out for public review until the end of the month on software citation. That's extremely difficult because software very rarely gives an indication that it is in fact software. So it's some of these newer types that are much harder to pick off. The advantage with preprint servers is generally if the preprint server name is included in the citation, it's pretty easy to say that's a preprint, but that's not true for data and software.
And John, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Well, Bruce is far more expert in the sphere than I am. I would just simply say that even among preprint servers, there have been differences in practice. For example, some preprint servers have a different DOI for different versions of a specific manuscript. We elected at the beginning of bioRxiv to go for a single DOI, and the versions are distinguished by the URL of each version of the same manuscript. And we haven't any reason so far anyway to think that was a mistake, but that's not a universal practice. But Bruce's point, I mean, the question was about the things that are hard to cite, and I think Bruce absolutely put his finger on the data issue, and that's an emerging area of discussion.
Thank you so much. All right, well, we have actually come to time, and I would like to thank both Bruce and John for providing us with their expertise and thought-provoking discussions today. I know attendees learn things that can be taken back to the office and put directly into practice, as well as we've got follow-up reading now. So there we are. And then thank you to all of the attendees as well, and those of you who are watching the video after the fact. And also, again, one last thank you to our sponsors. So with that, I think we will conclude our session. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.